My son sent me to prison for 2 years, blaming me for his wife's miscarriage, something I never did. Every month they came to visit me, but I always refused to see them. The day of my release will also be the very day they lose everything. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The heavy iron gate of the state penitentiary slammed shut behind me with a sound like a gunshot. It was 10 degrees below zero in Chicago, and the wind cut through my thin prison-issued jacket like a razor. I stood there shivering on the concrete, not from the cold, but from the rage that had kept me warm for 730 days. I expected to walk to the bus stop alone. I expected silence, but then I saw it. A sleek black limousine rolling slowly through the snow like a hearse. I knew that car. I bought it 3 years ago. The window rolled down, and the face of my son Brandon appeared. He did not look at my eyes. He looked at my worn-out shoes. I took a step forward, thinking perhaps a shred of humanity remained in him. Maybe he had come to apologize. Maybe he had come to take me home. I was wrong. The back door opened and Vanessa stepped out. My daughter-in-law, wrapped in a white fur coat that probably cost more than my bail. She looked at me with a smile that could freeze hell over. "Well, Conrad, you look terrible," she said, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "I hope the accommodations were to your liking. We certainly enjoyed the peace and quiet while you were away." I clenched my fists inside my pockets. My knuckles turned white. I simply looked at her. I did not want to give her the satisfaction of my anger. "Where is he?" I asked, my voice raspy from disuse. "Where is my grandson?" Vanessa laughed, a cruel, high-pitched sound that echoed in the empty parking lot. She placed a gloved hand on her flat stomach. "Oh, that. You really are senile, aren't you, old man? You killed him, remember? That is what the judge said. That is what Brandon believes. And that is why you are never going to see us again." Brandon finally stepped out of the car. He looked softer than I remembered. Weaker. He would not meet my gaze. He threw a crumpled envelope into the slush at my feet. It was not a welcome home card. It was a restraining order. 500 feet, Conrad. Stay 500 feet away from the house. 500 feet away from the company. And 500 feet away from us. If you violate it, you go back inside for 10 years. Brandon tossed a small roll of bills onto the wet pavement next to the legal papers. $200. That is for a bus ticket to Florida. Go die somewhere warm, Dad. Do us both a favor. They got back into the heated car without another word. I stood there as the engine purred and the tires crunched over the snow, driving away my legacy, my fortune, and my family. I bent down and picked up the muddy bills and the court order. I did not cry. Tears are for men who have nothing left to lose. I had everything to gain. As I watched the red taillights fade into the white storm, my eyes were dry. They thought they were leaving a broken old man in the snow. They did not know they had just unleashed a wolf. The game had just begun. The $200 in my pocket felt like lead weights, but I did not hail a cab. I walked. Step after painful step on the frozen asphalt, heading back toward the skyline of Chicago that I helped build. The biting wind on my face was nothing compared to the memory that played on a loop in my mind. The memory of the day my life ended. It was not the cold that made me shiver, but the phantom sensation of handcuffs snapping around my wrists in the hallway of my own home. I could still smell the sterile air of the courtroom. I was not a violent man, I was a builder, but in that trial I was painted as a monster. I could still see Vanessa sitting on the witness stand, dabbing dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. She told the jury I pushed her down the main staircase. She told them I called her unworthy. She told them I wanted to kill her unborn child because I was a bitter old man who wanted to control everything. It was a performance worthy of an Academy Award. The worst part was not her lies. It was the silence of the room as 12 strangers looked at me with pure disgust. I wanted to scream that she had thrown herself down those stairs. I wanted to scream that I was halfway across the room when she fell. But my high-priced defense attorney told me to remain silent, to let the truth prevail. The truth never had a chance. The moment that truly broke me happened when the prosecutor called his star witness. Brandon. My lawyer had whispered that my son would clear my name, that Brandon would tell the court how I supported them, how I paid off his gambling debts, how I welcomed Vanessa despite her gold-digging past. But when Brandon took the stand, he did not look at me. He looked at his shoes just like he did today in the prison parking lot. The prosecutor asked him if I had a temper. Brandon hesitated, then delivered the line that sealed my coffin. "Yes," he said softly into the microphone. "My father always hated Vanessa. He told me he would get rid of her one way or another. That lie cost me 730 days of breathing stale air. It cost me my reputation as the city's most respected developer. And it cost me the last shred of love I held for my own flesh and blood." A truck horn blared, jolting me back to the gray present. I was miles away from the prison now, standing on the edge of the city limits. My legs were numb, but my resolve was iron. I found what I was looking for outside a derelict gas station. A payphone. A relic from a bygone era, forgotten and ignored, just like me. Perfect. I did not want digital footprints. I did not want GPS trackers. I picked up the receiver, which smelled of stale tobacco and cheap whiskey. My fingers, stiff from the cold, struggled to deposit the coins. I dialed a number I had memorized a lifetime ago. It rang once, twice. The voice on the other end was gruff and impatient. It was Lawrence. The only shark in Chicago vicious enough to help me eat the others alive. The neon sign of Joe's Diner flickered with a dying buzz, casting a sickly yellow light onto the wet pavement. It was the kind of place where truck drivers stopped for coffee, and regrets the perfect place for a dead man to meet his ghost. I pushed open the door, the bell jingling softly, and spotted him immediately in the back booth. Lawrence, my attorney, my oldest friend, and the only man in Chicago who knew where the bodies were buried. He looked out of place in his Italian silk suit, nervously tapping a gold pen against the laminated table. When he saw me, his eyes widened. He took in my ragged coat, my unshaven face, and the smell of prison that still clung to me. "My God, Conrad," he whispered as I slid into the booth opposite him. "They really did a number on you." I did not have time for pity. I motioned for the waitress to bring black coffee and got straight to the point. "Tell me the damage, Lawrence. Do not sugarcoat it." He slid a thick manila envelope across the table. His hand shook slightly. "It is bad, Conrad. Worse than we thought. Since they declared you mentally incompetent during the trial, Brandon has had power of attorney. He did not just run the company, he gutted it. The lake house is sold. The collection of vintage cars is gone. He liquidated the bond portfolio last month." Lawrence paused, looking down at his coffee. "And the penthouse. Vanessa is redecorating it. They are living in your home, sleeping in your bed, spending your money like water. According to the books, you are technically bankrupt." I sat there staring at the grease stains on the menu. Bankrupt. The word should have terrified me. Instead, I felt a cold calm settle over my chest. They thought they had cut off my supply lines. They thought they had starved the enemy. Lawrence leaned in, his voice urgent. "We can file an emergency injunction. We can sue for mismanagement. But it will take months, maybe years. And without liquid cash to pay the court fees, Conrad, I do not know how long we can fight." I took a sip of the bitter coffee and smiled. It was a smile that did not reach my eyes. "You are forgetting something, Lawrence. You are forgetting who taught Brandon everything he knows about business and who taught him nothing about survival. Do you remember the contingency plan we set up in '89, the Cayman Trust? Lawrence froze. He looked at me, realizing what I was saying. The shadow fund. The one account that was never listed in my name, never tied to the company, and never mentioned in the will. It had been compounding interest for 30 years. I am not bankrupt, Lawrence. I have enough money to buy this city twice over, but I am not going to use a cent of it. Not yet. Lawrence looked confused. Then what is the plan? If we do not sue them, what do we do? I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a growl. If I sue them, they get lawyers. They get to play the victim. No, I want to destroy them from the inside. I want to see exactly what Vanessa is hiding. I want to know why she lied about the baby. And to do that, I need to be invisible. I stood up, leaving the last of my prison money on the table as a tip. Get me a fake ID, Lawrence, and call the cleaning contractor for Sullivan Corp. I hear they are looking for a new janitor. The glass facade of Sullivan Tower rose 60 stories into the gray Chicago sky, reflecting the storm clouds above. I stood on the sidewalk looking up at the steel and concrete empire I had built with my own 2 hands. Every beam, every window, every rivet held a memory of a deal closed or a crisis averted. Now I was walking toward the revolving doors, not as the CEO who commanded armies of contractors, but as a beggar in a thrift store coat that smelled of mothballs and despair. The security guard at the front desk was a young man I did not recognize. He looked up from his monitor, his eyes scanning me with the practiced disdain of someone used to keeping the riffraff out. He reached for his radio, ready to call for backup. I did not blame him. I looked like a man who had lost a fight with a garbage truck. Before the guard could speak, the elevator doors pinged open. The sound was crisp and sharp, cutting through the lobby's hushed atmosphere. Out stepped the new royalty, Brandon and Vanessa. They were laughing about something, probably spending money they had not earned until they saw me. Brandon froze. The blood drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. He actually took a step back, instinctively shielding himself behind his wife. It was a pathetic display of cowardice that made my stomach turn. Vanessa, however, did not flinch. She stopped in her tracks, her designer stilettos clicking sharply on the Italian marble floor I had personally selected 20 years ago. She tilted her head, observing me like a scientist observing a particularly interesting insect. Well, well, she purred, her voice echoing in the cavernous lobby. Look who decided to violate the restraining order. Shall I call the police now, Conrad, or do you want to save your breath and crawl back to whatever hole you came from? This was the moment. The performance of a lifetime. I let my shoulders slump. I allowed my legs to buckle. I dropped to my knees, right there in the middle of the lobby. It was the hardest physical thing I had ever done, not because of the arthritis in my joints, but because of the sheer weight of my pride. But I had to sell it. I clasped my trembling hands together and looked up at them with watery eyes. Please, I begged, my voice cracking perfectly. I have nowhere to go. The shelter is full. I have no money for food. I just want to work. I will do anything. I looked at Brandon, banking on his guilt. Son, please. I built this company. Let me just sweep the floors. Let me clean the toilets. Just give me minimum wage so I can eat. I promise I will not speak to you. I will be invisible. Brandon looked around nervously, terrified that his employees might see his father begging on the floor. This is embarrassing, he hissed. Get up, Dad. You cannot be here. We have clients coming. Go away, and I will send you $50. Just leave. He reached for his phone to transfer the money, but Vanessa stopped his hand. Her eyes lit up with a twisted, dark idea. A slow, cruel smile spread across her red lips as she realized the opportunity standing before her. Wait, she said. Why should we send him away, Brandon? He says he wants to work. And we are actually short a janitor on the executive floor since I fired the last one for looking me in the eye. Brandon looked at her in horror. You cannot be serious, Vanessa. He is my father. You want him scrubbing floors. Vanessa laughed, touching his cheek condescendingly. He is a convict, Brandon, and he is broke. We are doing a charitable deed giving an ex-con a second chance. Besides, she leaned in closer to me, her expensive perfume overpowering the smell of floor wax. I think it is fitting. The man who built the tower should know how to clean its filth. What do you say, Conrad? Do you want to scrub my toilet for $11 an hour? Thank you, I whispered, keeping my head down to hide the fire burning in my eyes. Thank you for your kindness. 10 minutes later, I was standing in the maintenance closet pulling on a gray jumpsuit that smelled of bleach and old sweat. It was 2 sizes too small. I picked up a mop and a bucket. When I returned to the lobby, Vanessa was sitting on the leather sofa watching me. She deliberately dropped a sticky wrapper from her protein bar onto the pristine floor. Oops, she said, smirking. Missed the trash can. Clean it up, Conrad. I moved forward, dragging the heavy mop. I knelt at her feet and picked up the trash. From this angle, I could see the absolute triumph in her eyes. She thought she had won. She thought she had broken me. She did not know that while I was scrubbing the floor at her feet, I was studying her. I was memorizing the pattern of her day, the access codes she punched into her phone, and the location of every skeleton she thought she had buried. The door to the executive suite opened with a biometric scan that I used to control but now had to prop open with a rubber doorstop. I pushed my cleaning cart into the room that had been my sanctuary for 40 years. The air inside no longer smelled of old books and pipe tobacco. It reeked of expensive lavender and aggressive modernity. My mahogany desk where I had signed the contracts that built this city was gone. In its place stood a cold glass monstrosity that looked more like an ice sculpture than a workspace. The warm leather chairs were replaced by sharp, uncomfortable, angular furniture that screamed vanity over substance. But it was the wall behind the desk that stopped my heart. For 3 decades, a portrait of my late wife Eleanor had hung there. It was a painting commissioned on our silver anniversary, capturing her kindness and the quiet strength that had anchored me. Now the wall was dominated by a disturbing, abstract nude painting. It was vulgar and chaotic, a perfect reflection of the woman who now sat in my chair. I lowered my head and gripped the handle of the mop so hard the wood groaned. I told myself to focus on the job. I told myself I was just the janitor. But then I moved to the wastebasket. It was a sleek chrome bin filled with the debris of Vanessa's morning, half-eaten croissants and crumpled memos. And there at the bottom, buried under wet coffee grounds and shredded paper, was a glint of silver. I reached in my hand, trembling not from age but from a rage so pure it felt like white heat in my veins. I pulled it out. It was the silver frame I had given Eleanor on her 50th birthday. The glass was shattered. Her smiling face was smeared with coffee stains. The frame had not fallen by accident. It had been stomped on. The heel mark of a stiletto was clearly visible on the backing. I fell to my knees, clutching the ruined photo to my chest. A guttural sound tried to escape my throat, a scream of grief and fury, but I swallowed it down. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper. My fingernails dug into the palm of my hand, piercing the skin until I felt the wet slick of blood against the photo frame. They could take my money. They could take my company. But to treat the memory of the woman who had welcomed them into this family with such desecration was an act of war. I wiped the photo carefully with the edge of my gray jumpsuit and tucked it inside my shirt next to my beating heart. I looked up at the glass desk. Vanessa would be back from her lunch in 10 minutes. I wiped the blood from my hand onto my pants and reached into the hidden pocket of my boot. I pulled out a small black disc, no larger than a dime. It was a listening device I had traded 3 cartons of cigarettes for in prison, engineered by a hacker who was serving time for penetrating the Pentagon. I crawled under the desk. To anyone watching, I was scrubbing a stubborn stain. In reality, I was planting a bomb. I pressed the device onto the metal frame of the desk, completely hidden from view. A tiny red light blinked once, then vanished. It was live. I crawled out backwards just as the elevator dinged down the hall. Let them talk. Let them laugh. I would be the shadow in the room listening to every breath they took. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open, and I walked inside carrying a silver tray. The room was exactly as I left it. The sprawling mahogany table I had imported from Italy still dominated the space, reflecting the gray Chicago skyline in its polished surface. But the man sitting at the head of the table was not a king. He was a jester wearing a stolen crown. I adjusted my grip on the heavy pitcher and stepped onto the plush carpet. My job was to serve water and coffee to the board members. Men and women who used to beg for 5 minutes of my time were now ignoring me, treating me like invisible furniture. I made my way to the head of the table. Brandon was in the middle of a presentation. He was stumbling over the numbers, clearly unprepared, trying to sell a merger that would destroy the company's soul. When he saw me approaching, his eyes lit up with a malicious gleam. He stopped speaking mid-sentence and the room fell silent. Everyone turned to look at the old janitor with the gray jumpsuit. Brandon smiled a smile that was pure poison. "Pour it," he commanded, pointing to his empty ceramic cup without looking at me. I leaned forward, the heavy pitcher shaking slightly in my grip. I was careful. I was precise. I had poured concrete for skyscrapers, so I could certainly pour tea. But it did not matter. As the steaming liquid filled the cup, Brandon jerked his hand. It was a subtle movement, just enough to knock the pitcher. The boiling water splashed over the rim, cascading onto my wrist, and down onto his expensive Italian loafers. The pain was immediate and searing. My skin blistered instantly, but I bit my tongue so hard I tasted blood, refusing to let out a single sound of pain. "You clumsy idiot," Brandon shouted, jumping up. His chair scraped violently against the floor. "Look what you did. These are alligator skin. They cost more than your entire life." He looked around the room, seeking validation from his sycophants. "Can you believe this incompetence? This is why we need to clean house, starting with the trash." He pointed a manicured finger at his wet shoes. "Clean it up. Now." The room was dead silent. I could feel the pity and the disgust radiating from the investors. Slowly, painfully, I lowered myself to my knees. My joints popped in the quiet room. I pulled a rag from my back pocket and began to dab at the wet leather of my son's shoes. I wiped the shoes of the boy I had taught to walk. I kept my head bowed, hiding the fire in my eyes. I was not cleaning shoes. I was polishing my rage. I was fueling the engine of my vengeance with every humiliating stroke. As I finished and began to stand up, I felt a gaze burning into me from the far end of the table. I looked up. It was a senior shareholder, a man who had been with me since the day I laid the first brick of this building. He was squinting at me, his face pale. He recognized the way I stood. He recognized the scar on my chin and the steel in my eyes beneath the grime. He started to stand up, his mouth opening to say my name. I locked eyes with him and gave a nearly imperceptible shake of my head. I brought a single finger to my lips. Silence. The old man sank back into his chair, his eyes wide with understanding. I turned and limped out of the room, leaving Brandon to gloat over his petty victory. He thought he had just humiliated a janitor. He did not know that the game had just begun. The supply closet on the 42nd floor was my new penthouse. It smelled of industrial solvent and stale dust. My bed was a pile of old drop cloths that I had scavenged from a renovation project on the lower levels. At night, the building groaned like a dying beast shifting in the wind. I lay there staring at the exposed pipes, listening to the hum of the server room next door. It was a far cry from the Egyptian cotton sheets I used to sleep on, but comfort is a luxury for the innocent. I was not innocent. I was a hunter waiting in the dark. I adjusted the cheap plastic earpiece I had salvaged. The red light on my receiver blinked in the darkness, a steady heartbeat. For 3 nights, I had heard nothing but the cleaning crews vacuuming and the occasional security guard patrolling the halls. But tonight was different. At exactly 2 in the morning, the silence broke. The bug I had planted under Vanessa's desk activated. It was Vanessa. Her voice was not the shrill weapon she used on Brandon. It was low, husky, and terrifyingly calm. "He is asleep," she whispered. "The idiot took 3 sleeping pills. He would not wake up if the house burned down." I pressed the receiver against my ear, my heart hammering against my ribs. She was not talking to herself. A man's voice crackled on the other end, too muffled to identify, but the familiarity in their tone made my stomach turn. They were not just discussing business. There was an intimacy there, a shared secret that made my skin crawl. "Do not worry about the old man," Vanessa continued, her laugh sounding like breaking glass. "He is scrubbing toilets. He is broken. He is too busy trying to keep his dignity to notice what is happening. Now listen to me. I initiated the transfer 10 minutes ago. $3 million from the operational fund to the Zurich account. The account number ends in 459. Yes, I know it leaves the payroll account empty. Let the employees starve for a week. We will be in the Maldives by the time they figure it out." I sat up in the darkness, the drop cloths sliding off my shoulders. $3 million. That was the last of the liquid capital. She was not just stealing from the company, she was gutting it like a fish. She was preparing to run, and she was going to leave my son holding the bag for massive embezzlement. I looked at the small digital recorder in my hand, watching the tape spin, capturing every damning word. She thought she was talking to a philosopher in the shadows. She did not know that the true shadow was listening from a broom closet 10 floors below. I had the gun. Now I just needed the bullets. I reached for my notebook and wrote down the timestamp. The robbery was in progress, but the arrest was going to be my masterpiece. The executive washroom attached to my former office was the only place Vanessa felt comfortable enough to drop her guard. It was a sanctuary of marble and gold, where she applied her makeup and likely disposed of the evidence of her double life. I waited until I saw her leave for her 2-hour lunch appointment with the divorce lawyer she claimed was a business consultant. I pushed my cleaning cart into the suite and locked the main door, but I knew the bathroom had a separate biometric entry. I had to be fast. I was not looking for financial documents this time. I was looking for biology. I was looking for the truth about the air that never was. I knelt on the cold tile floor and pulled the small chrome pedal bin from under the sink. It was lined with a scented bag meant to mask reality, but garbage is garbage. I put on a pair of fresh latex gloves and began to sift through the refuse of the woman who had stolen my life. Used tissues, makeup wipes, cotton balls stained with toner. It was revolting work for a man who used to command thousands of employees, but I treated it like an archaeological dig. I was looking for a specific artifact. I moved a pile of discarded packaging and saw it. A small orange prescription bottle at the bottom. The label had been partially peeled off, but the pharmacy code was still visible. Suddenly, the electronic lock on the suite door chirped. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. She was back early. I had no time to put the bin back properly. I had no time to hide. I did the only thing I could do. I grabbed the toilet brush and plunged it into the bowl, splashing water onto the floor. I hunched my shoulders, curving my spine until I looked like a question mark. I began to mutter loudly, aggressively, talking to the porcelain, as if it were a living enemy. The bathroom door swung open. Vanessa stood there, freezing in the doorway. She was holding a shopping bag, her eyes wide with shock that turned instantly to fury. "What are you doing in here?" she screamed. "I told you to clean the hallway, not my private bathroom." I did not look at her directly. I kept scrubbing the clean toilet bowl, my movements jerky and manic. The spots I mumbled, my voice trembling with feigned senility. "The spots are everywhere, Eleanor. They won't come out. The blood won't come out of the water." I splashed more water onto her expensive shoes. Vanessa recoiled, stepping back into the office to avoid the spray. "You crazy old lunatic," she hissed. Get out! Get out before I have security throw you out the window." She did not see a spy. She did not see a father-in-law gathering evidence. She saw a broken, demented old man who had lost his mind. Her arrogance was her blindfold. I stood up, clutching the trash bag in one hand and the brush in the other, bowing repeatedly like a servant. "I am sorry, miss, I am sorry. The spots are bad today." I shuffled out of the office, keeping my head down until I was safely in the service elevator. Only then did I unclench my left fist. Inside my palm was the orange pill bottle I had snatched from the bin a split second before she entered. I held it up to the harsh fluorescent light. The name of the medication was clear enough. Estradiol, high-dosage hormone replacement therapy. It was a drug used for women who had undergone a total hysterectomy. A pregnant woman taking this would be medical malpractice. But a woman with no uterus needed it to stop her body from aging. I slipped the bottle into my pocket. I finally had the gun. Now it was time to point it. The witching hour. That is what we used to call 0200 in the Corps, the time when the guard is most tired and the shadows are deepest. Sullivan Tower was asleep, but it was a restless sleep filled with the hum of servers and the groaning of settling steel. I moved through the service corridors not as a janitor this time, but as a ghost haunting the castle he had built. My target was the archives room on the 30th floor. It was a windowless vault where the company buried its history and its bodies. I reached the heavy steel door and stopped. The keypad was new, a digital fortress that required a 6-digit code I did not have. But I did not need the code. I knew the man who installed the conduit piping behind these walls because I was the one who hired him 20 years ago. I knew that the backup power for the magnetic lock ran through a junction box just above the ceiling tile. I dragged my cleaning ladder over my joints, popping in protest. I pushed the tile aside and reached into the darkness. My hand brushed against a bundle of wires. I had to find the blue coaxial cable. If I cut the wrong one, the silent alarm would scream at the precinct downtown, and I would be back in a cell before sunrise. I pulled a small pair of wire cutters from my jumpsuit pocket. My hands, which used to assemble rifles in the dark, were trembling slightly. Not from fear, from age, from the arthritis that gnawed at my knuckles. I took a deep breath, steadying my heart rate just as I had done in the jungles of Vietnam. I squeezed the handle. Snip. The red light on the keypad flickered and died. The magnetic lock disengaged with a heavy clunk. I slipped inside, closing the door behind me. The room smelled of old paper and toner. I did not turn on the lights. I used a small pen light, holding it between my teeth as I scanned the rows of bankers' boxes. Vanessa was organized, I would give her that. Everything was labeled by year and department. I moved to the section marked Fiscal Year 2021. This was the year before my trial. The year before the chaos. I pulled down a heavy box labeled Loan Agreements. I flipped through the files, my fingers flying over the paperwork, and then I froze. There it was. A loan application for $5 million from a private equity firm in the Cayman Islands. It was dated 3 months before the alleged miscarriage, and at the bottom of the page was my signature, Conrad Sullivan. The loops were perfect, the slant was precise. To the naked eye, it was authentic. But I knew the truth. I pulled out my reading glasses and held the light closer. On the date this document was signed, I was in a hospital in Cleveland undergoing hip surgery. I was under heavy sedation. I could not have signed a birthday card, let alone a multi-million-dollar loan. I looked closer at the ink. It was slightly raised at the edges. A tracing. A high-quality forgery done by a machine or a master artist. This was the smoking gun. They did not just react to a tragic accident. They had been planning to leverage the company and frame me for the debt long before Vanessa ever faked a pregnancy. This was premeditated murder of my character. I pulled the document out, folding it carefully, and sliding it into the waistband of my pants. The alarm on my watch vibrated. The security patrol would be on this floor in 4 minutes. I had what I needed. It was time to vanish. The atmosphere in the executive suite was brittle enough to snap. I was polishing the glass doors of the conference room using a rag that was grayer than my future appeared to be, but my eyes were fixed on the reflection of my son. Brandon was pacing back and forth in front of Vanessa's desk, his face flushed with a mixture of panic and confusion. He held a tablet in his shaking hands, scrolling through the quarterly expense reports. I could see the red lines from here. The bleeding had started, and he was finally noticing the wound. Vanessa, $50,000 does not just vanish from the petty cash account. Brandon stammered, his voice rising an octave. And the logistics budget is down 12%. The auditors are coming next week. If they see this, they will flag the accounts. Where is the money going? I stopped wiping the glass and held my breath. This was it. The moment the house of cards should have collapsed. But I had underestimated Vanessa's ability to improvise. She did not even look up from her manicure. She simply sighed as if explaining quantum physics to a toddler. Oh, Brandon, you really are terrible at micromanaging, aren't you? It is leakage, darling. It is the staff. They sense your weakness. They are padding their expenses, taking long lunches and stealing supplies. And frankly, the biggest leak is standing right outside the door. She pointed a perfectly filed nail in my direction. Brandon turned his head sharply, his eyes locking onto me. Vanessa stood up and walked around the desk, placing her hands on his shoulders, massaging the tension while whispering poison into his ear. Think about it, Brandon. Who has access to every room? Who is desperate for money? Who hates you for taking his throne? Your father is not just cleaning floors. He is stealing from you. I saw him taking boxes of toner yesterday. He is probably selling them on the street corner for booze money. He is a thief, Brandon. Once a criminal, always a criminal. The manipulation was masterfully cruel. She took his fear of financial ruin and converted it into rage directed at the only person he felt superior to. Me. Brandon marched out of the office, his face twisted into a mask of ugly entitlement. He did not see his father. He saw a scapegoat. He grabbed me by the collar of my jumpsuit and shoved me against the wall. The cleaning cart rattled, and a bottle of window cleaner fell to the floor with a loud crash. "Empty your pockets," he screamed, shaking me so hard my teeth rattled. "Empty them right now, you old thief. Where is the money? What did you take today? Pens, paper? Or did you manage to swipe a laptop?" I raised my hands in a gesture of surrender, my eyes wide with feigned terror. "Son, please," I stammered, playing the part of the confused geriatric. "I have nothing. Just trash. Just trash I found on the floor." "Liar," Brandon roared. He shoved his hand into my pocket and pulled out a single expensive fountain pen that I had found under the boardroom table earlier that morning. It was his pen. I had intended to return it. "See," he yelled, waving the pen in my face like a weapon. "Stealing. Stealing from your own son." The slap came out of nowhere. It was a backhanded strike across my face, sharp and stinging. My head snapped to the side and I tasted blood on my lip. The hallway went silent. The secretaries stared. Vanessa stood in the doorway smiling like a satisfied cat. Brandon breathed heavily, looking at his hand, as if surprised by his own violence, but he did not apologize. He felt powerful. "Get back to work," he spat, straightening his tie. "And if I catch you stealing so much as a paperclip again, I will have the police drag you out of here." He turned and walked back into his office, slamming the door. I touched my swelling lip and looked at the blood on my fingertip. He had struck his father to please a thief. That slap did not hurt me. It liberated me. It severed the last thread of mercy I had for him. The boiler room in the basement of Sullivan Tower was a place where the heat was suffocating and the noise of the machinery was deafening. It was the heart of the building, pumping hot water and air to the executives above, who never gave a second thought to where their comfort came from. It was also the only place where I could be certain there were no cameras and no microphones. I stood in the shadow of a massive furnace, sweat trickling down my back, under the gray jumpsuit, holding the envelope that Lawrence had taped behind a pressure gauge earlier that morning. My hands, which were covered in soot and calluses, trembled slightly as I broke the seal. This was not a financial report. This was not a bank statement. This was the holy grail of my investigation. Inside was a certified copy of a medical file from St. Mary's Hospital in Boston, a facility Vanessa had visited 5 years ago, long before she met my son. I pulled out the single sheet of paper and held it up to the dim light of a service bulb. The medical terminology was dense, but the conclusion was undeniable. Patient Vanessa Sullivan. Date of procedure, October 14, 2018. Procedure, total abdominal hysterectomy. Indication, severe endometriosis. I read the words again, my lips moving silently as I processed the biological reality. A hysterectomy. The surgical removal of the uterus. I leaned back against the hot metal of the furnace, feeling the air leave my lungs. If she had no uterus in 2018, then she could not have been pregnant in 2021. The pregnancy, the ultrasound photos, the baby bump she had lovingly cradled at dinner parties, it was all a lie. A fabrication. A performance so committed that she had fooled everyone, including her husband. My mind flashed back to that terrible day on the staircase. The day she fell. I remembered the blood. There had been so much blood soaking into the white carpet. I remembered the way she screamed, clutching her stomach, looking at me with eyes full of terror, accusing me of murdering her child. I had felt a guilt so profound it nearly killed me. I had spent 2 years in a prison cell, waking up every night from nightmares about that unborn baby. But it was not blood. It was corn syrup and red dye. It was a special effect. And the doctor who treated her, the one who came to the house instead of calling an ambulance, he must have been on her payroll. There was no baby to lose. There was no grandson to mourn. A low growl started deep in my throat, a sound that was more animal than human. I looked up at the ceiling towards the penthouse where my son was currently living in misery, grieving a child that never existed. Vanessa had not just stolen my money. She had not just stolen my freedom. She had weaponized a man's deepest desire to be a father and used it to destroy his relationship with his own dad. I crushed the medical report in my fist, turning the paper into a tight ball. The jagged edges dug into my palm. Brandon was a fool and a coward, but he was also a victim of a cruelty so sophisticated it chilled me to the bone. She had played God. She had created life and destroyed it just to get a signature on a deed. I shoved the crumpled paper into my pocket. My hands were no longer shaking. They were steady. They were ready. "You killed my sons, love with a ghost," I whispered to the humming machinery. "And now the ghost is coming for you." The loading dock behind the building was the only place where the wind howled louder than the city traffic. I stood behind a dumpster shielded from the security cameras and pulled a cheap prepaid burner phone from my pocket. I had bought it with cash from a pawn shop during my lunch break. It was a disposable weapon for a disposable war. My fingers, thick and scarred from years of laying brick, hovered over the keypad. I did not need to write a novel. Doubt is a seed that grows best in the dark, so I kept it simple. I typed a single sentence. "Ask your wife what really happened at St. Mary's Hospital in 2018. I pressed send. Then I dropped the phone onto the concrete and crushed it under the heel of my work boot until it was nothing but plastic shrapnel and silicon dust. I returned to the executive floor just as the elevator dinged. I picked up my mop and moved into position outside the glass doors of the suite. My earpiece was live. The bug under Vanessa's desk was transmitting every sound with crystal clarity. I heard the chime of a text message arriving on Brandon's private cell phone. There was a pause, a silence that stretched for 10 seconds. Then I heard the sound of a chair being pushed back violently. "What is this?" Brandon's voice was trembling, not with anger, but with fear. He sounded like a child who had just found a monster in his closet. "Vanessa, look at this. Who is this number? Why are they asking about 2018? That was 3 years before we met." I leaned closer to the glass, moving the mop in slow, rhythmic circles. Inside the office, Vanessa's voice was sharp, dismissive. "It is spam, Brandon. Delete it. Probably some phishing scam trying to get your data. Do not be so paranoid." "No," Brandon shouted. His voice cracked. "It is not spam. It is specific. St. Mary's. That is the hospital where you had your appendix removed, right? Or was it something else? Why would a stranger know about that? Is someone blackmailing us? Is it one of your ex-boyfriends?" I heard the sound of glass shattering. Vanessa had thrown something. "Stop it," she hissed. Her voice had lost its smooth, manipulative quality. It was cold and hard like steel. "You are acting like a lunatic. Nobody knows anything because there is nothing to know. Delete the message. Now." The door to the office flew open. Brandon stormed out, his face pale and sweating. He looked like a man who was drowning on dry land. He rushed past me without even seeing me, running towards the elevators, loosening his tie as if it were a noose. He was going home to drink. He always ran away when the questions got too hard. But Vanessa did not run. She stood in the doorway of the office, her chest heaving slightly. She did not chase after her husband. Instead, she stopped and took a deep breath, composing herself. Then she slowly turned her head. Her eyes swept the hallway, scanning every corner, every shadow. She was a predator sensing a shift in the wind. She knew that text message did not come from a stranger. She knew it came from someone close, someone who had access. Her gaze landed on me. I was 20 feet away, hunched over my mop, wringing out gray water into the yellow bucket. I did not look up. I kept my eyes on the floor, playing the part of the invisible servant. But I could feel her staring at the back of my neck. It was a physical weight. She watched me for a long time, studying my posture, my hands, my rhythm. She was wondering if the old man was truly senile or if he was the most dangerous thing in the building. "Hey, you!" she called out. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. I stopped mopping and turned slowly, blinking confusedly behind my glasses. "Yes, ma'am." "Empty the trash in the conference room," she said, never taking her eyes off my face. "And leave the door open. I want to see who comes and goes on this floor. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am," I mumbled, shuffling away. I could feel her eyes drilling into my back until I turned the corner. She did not know it was me yet, but she knew there was a ghost in the machine. Good. Paranoia causes mistakes, and she was about to make a fatal one. The air in the office was thick with paranoia. It smelled of stale coffee and fear. Vanessa was no longer the confident queen of the boardroom. She was a cornered animal, and cornered animals bite. I pushed my cleaning cart down the hallway, the squeak of the wheel marking my approach like a metronome. I knew she was waiting for me. I could feel her gaze through the frosted glass, even before I opened the door. When I entered, she was sitting behind her desk, perfectly still. She was not typing. She was not on the phone. She was watching the door. And there it was. The bait. Lying right on the edge of the glass desk, perilously close to falling off, was a bright red folder. It was labeled in bold black marker. Cayman Island accounts. Access codes. It was so obvious it was insulting. She had placed it there with the precision of a hunter setting a snare. She wanted me to take it. She wanted to catch the rat with his hand in the cookie jar so she could call the police and have me thrown back in prison for corporate espionage. I shuffled into the room, dragging my feet, my head bowed low. I mumbled a greeting that was unintelligible, a mix of apology and nonsense. I started dusting the bookshelves, moving slowly, methodically, working my way toward the desk. Every muscle in my body was tense. I knew that one wrong look, one glance that was too sharp would give me away. I had to be the old fool. I had to be the invisible man. I reached the desk. Vanessa did not blink. Her hand was resting near the intercom button, ready to call security. I pulled my gray rag from my back pocket. It was filthy, stained with furniture polish and grime. I reached out for the red folder. I saw her knuckles turn white. She was ready to pounce. I picked up the folder. It was heavy. Real documents inside. She was committed to the trap. I held it in my hand for a second, and I heard her inhale sharply. This was the moment. The trap was sprung. But I did not open it. I did not slip it into my shirt. Instead, I lifted it up and wiped the glass surface underneath it with my dirty rag, scrubbing at a non-existent coffee ring. Then I took the rag and wiped the cover of the folder itself, smearing a streak of gray dust across the word Cayman. Must keep it clean, I muttered to myself, loud enough for her to hear. Dust everywhere. Dust on the red paper. I placed the folder back on the desk, but I put it down, crooked upside down and dangerously close to her coffee cup. I treated the most sensitive financial documents in the company like a cheap coaster. Vanessa's face went purple. The vein in her forehead pulsed. She had been ready for a confrontation, for a scream of victory. Instead, she was watching an old man clean confidential files with a dirty rag. She slammed her hand down on the desk, making the folder jump. "What are you doing?" she shrieked, her voice shrill and breaking. "Did you read that? Did you look inside that folder?" I recoiled, dropping my rag in feigned terror. I squinted at her, blinking rapidly. "Read it, ma'am." "No, ma'am. I left my reading glasses at the shelter. I can't read anything smaller than a stop sign without them. I was just dusting. It was dusty." "Get out!" she screamed, pointing at the door. Her hand was shaking uncontrollably. She was furious, not because I had done something wrong, but because I hadn't. I had denied her the satisfaction of destroying me. I picked up my rag and shuffled backward, bowing apologetically. "Sorry, ma'am. Just cleaning. Just cleaning." I closed the door behind me and listened. I heard the sound of the red folder being thrown across the room, hitting the wall with a dull thud. She was unraveling. She was losing control. And a pilot who loses control of the plane is destined to crash. I smiled at the janitor in the hallway mirror. The trap had failed. And now the hunter was left with nothing but an empty snare and a rising tide of panic. The rumor mill in a skyscraper moves faster than the elevators, but today I did not need rumors. I heard the death knell of my legacy with my own ears. I was replacing the water cooler bottle outside the main boardroom when the heavy oak doors swung open. Brandon walked out, flanked by two lawyers in cheap suits. He looked manic, his eyes wild and bloodshot, the look of a gambler who had just bet his last chip. He was on the phone, his voice echoing down the corridor loud enough for the entire floor to hear. "Done," he shouted into the receiver. "Yes, tell Falcon we accept the offer. We will sign the papers at the gala on Friday. Just get the wire transfer ready. I want out." I froze. The heavy plastic water bottle slipped from my grip and hit the floor with a hollow thud. Falcon. The Falcon Group. They were not just competitors, they were vultures. For 40 years, I had fought them tooth and nail. They cut corners. They used cheap materials. They treated their workers like cattle. I had spent my life ensuring that Sullivan Construction stood for quality, for integrity. And now my son was handing them the keys to my kingdom for what was undoubtedly a fraction of its value. He was selling my life's work to my worst enemy just to cover the holes Vanessa had burned in the accounts. Brandon spun around at the sound of the dropped bottle. When he saw me, a twisted smile spread across his face. He walked over to me, kicking the water bottle aside. Well, old man, he sneered, leaning in close. You should be happy. You are looking at a man who is about to be very rich. I am selling the company. I stared at him, my hands clenching into fists at my sides. You cannot! I whispered, my voice trembling with suppressed rage. This company is your heritage. It is the only thing I had to leave you. You are selling it to Falcon. They will dismantle it. They will fire everyone. Brandon laughed, a harsh barking sound. I do not care, he spat. I am sick of this place. I am sick of the stress. I am taking the cash, and Vanessa and I are moving to Europe. We are going to live like royalty while you rot in a state facility. It is over, Dad. The Sullivan name ends on Friday. He walked away, whistling a tune, leaving me standing there, while the water from the cracked bottle slowly pooled around my work boots. I felt a pain in my chest that had nothing to do with my heart condition. It was the pain of watching a building collapse in slow motion. Every beam I raised, every permit I fought for, every late night I spent reviewing blueprints, it was all being sold for scrap by a boy who never lifted anything heavier than a golf club. But as I watched him disappear into the elevator, the pain hardened into something cold and sharp. Friday. He had given me a deadline. The 30th anniversary gala. It was supposed to be a celebration of the past, but now it was the stage for a funeral. He planned to sign the death warrant of my company in front of the city's elite. I bent down and picked up the water bottle. My hands were steady now. He wanted to end the Sullivan name on Friday. Fine. I would give him an ending. But it would not be the one he expected. I would not let him sell my soul to Falcon. I had 3 days. 3 days to turn a celebration into an execution. I walked to the janitor closet and locked the door. I pulled out my burner phone. It was time to call the cavalry. The timeline had moved up. Judgment Day was coming early. The water in the executive bathroom was rising dangerously close to the rim of the porcelain bowl. It was not a natural blockage. The toilet was choked with thick wads of paper towels and what looked like an entire roll of spun silk ribbon. Vanessa stood in the doorway holding a handkerchief over her nose, her eyes dancing with malicious amusement. Fix it, she commanded, her voice muffled by the silk. And do not use the plunger. It makes too much noise and disturbs my concentration. Use your hands if you have to. Just get it done. I looked at the overflowing filth, and then at her. This was not about hygiene. This was about dominance. She wanted to see the man who once signed million-dollar checks kneeling in sewage. She wanted to break my spirit one flush at a time. I lowered myself to the wet floor, my knees splashing into the cold puddle spreading across the tiles. I did not complain. I did not look up. I simply rolled up the sleeves of my gray jumpsuit and reached into the water. 48 hours. I repeated the mantra in my head to keep from vomiting. 48 hours until the gala. 48 hours until the gavel drops. With every handful of wet paper I pulled from the pipe, I visualized her empire crumbling. The humiliation did not weaken me. It calcified my resolve. I was not a janitor cleaning a toilet. I was a soldier digging a trench. When the water finally drained with a loud gurgle, Vanessa let out a sigh of exaggerated relief. Finally, she sneered. You are actually good at this, Conrad. Maybe you have finally found your true calling. She kicked a pile of clothes that was lying in the corner. It was a designer suit jacket of Brandon's, stained with red wine. Take that to the dumpster on your way out, she said, turning on her heel. Brandon spilled Merlot on it yesterday. He bought a new one this morning. We do not do dry cleaning. It is for poor people. She slammed the door, leaving me alone with the smell of bleach and waste. I picked up the jacket. It was Italian wool, soft and expensive. A year ago, I would have scolded Brandon for such waste. Now I just saw an opportunity. Old habits die hard, so I patted down the pockets before throwing it in the trash bag. My fingers brushed against a small, stiff piece of paper in the inside breast pocket. I pulled it out. It was a yellow sticky note hurriedly scribbled in Brandon's handwriting. It read simply, "Safe combo," followed by 3 numbers, 182406. I stared at the numbers. They were not random. They were the date Vanessa claimed she found out she was pregnant. He had set the combination to the home safe based on the lie that ruined my life. I slipped the note into my pocket. The toilet was clean. The jacket was trash. But I had just found the key to the castle. The service entrance code was the one thing Brandon had been too lazy to change. 1972. The year I founded the company. I punched the numbers into the keypad, hidden behind the ivy, and the heavy door clicked open. I stepped into the kitchen of the house where I had raised my son, but it felt like stepping into a stranger's nightmare. The air was thick with the smell of stale champagne, marijuana smoke, and something rotting. It was the smell of decay masked by expensive air freshener. I moved silently through the hallway, my work boots sinking into the plush carpet that was now stained with dark blotches of spilled wine. This house used to be a sanctuary of order and warmth. Eleanor had filled it with flowers and classical music. Now it looked like the aftermath of a riot. I passed the living room and stopped. My wife's grand piano, a Steinway she had cherished for 40 years, was covered in empty beer bottles and overflowing ashtrays. Someone had carved their initials into the polished mahogany lid. I felt a physical blow to my chest, a pain sharper than any heart attack. They had not just stolen my house. They were desecrating my memories. They were pissing on the grave of the life I had built. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tear the curtains down and smash every bottle. But I forced myself to keep moving. Anger is fuel, but discipline is the engine. I was on a mission. I reached the library. It was the only room with the door closed. I pushed it open and switched on my penlight. The walls were still lined with my books, but the desk in the center was piled high with gambling slips and unpaid notices. I walked around the desk to the antique globe in the corner. Brandon probably thought it was just decoration. He did not know that behind it was a wall safe installed before he was born. I moved the globe aside, revealing the steel panel. I took the crumpled sticky note from my pocket. 182406. The date of the fake pregnancy. The date he used to lock away his secrets. My fingers hovered over the dial. If this code was wrong, the silent alarm would trigger and the police would be here in 3 minutes. I took a deep breath and turned the dial. 182406. Click. The handle turned smoothly. The heavy door swung open. The safe was nearly empty. The cash was gone. The jewelry was gone. But at the very back, tucked inside a blue envelope, was the one thing Brandon could not sell, but dared not destroy. I pulled it out. My hands trembled as I read the title page. Last Will and Testament of Eleanor Sullivan. I flipped to the 3rd page. There it was in black and white. In the event of my husband's incapacitation, my 40% share of Sullivan Construction shall be transferred to the Veteran Charity Trust, not to my son Brandon. Brandon had hidden this. He had suppressed his own mother's will so he could seize control of her shares, using my imprisonment as the excuse. He had stolen from the dead to rob the living. I folded the document and placed it inside my jumpsuit against my chest. It felt hot against my skin, like a brand. "You should have burned it, son," I whispered to the empty room. "You were too greedy to destroy the evidence, and now it is going to hang you." I closed the safe and turned to leave. I had the weapon. Now I just needed to aim. I turned to leave the library, the heavy weight of my wife's will pressed against my chest. I had what I needed to save the company, but as I reached for the door handle, a faint red pulse caught my eye. It was coming from the spine of a leather-bound encyclopedia on the top shelf. To anyone else, it would have been invisible, a trick of the light. But I spent 2 years in a cell watching the guards watch us. I knew what surveillance looked like. I dragged a chair over and climbed up. There, nestled between the pages of volume A through C, was a high-definition microcamera. Its lens was pointed directly at the safe I had just opened. My blood ran cold. Vanessa. She did not trust Brandon to keep the secret. She was watching him. She was watching the house. I looked around the room. Now that I knew what to look for, I saw them everywhere. A sensor in the smoke detector. A pinhole in the frame of the oil painting. She had turned my home into a prison panopticon. She was not just a thief, she was a warden. I knew where the feed would go. When I renovated this house, I installed a dedicated server in the panic room behind the wine cellar. I moved quickly down the hallway, ignoring the stench of the party debris. I reached the cellar and punched in the override code. The heavy steel door slid open. The server rack was humming, blinking with activity. I sat down at the terminal. My fingers flew across the keyboard. Vanessa had changed the admin password, of course, but she was predictable. I tried her birthday. Access denied. I tried the date of the fake miscarriage. Access denied. Then I typed in the one thing she truly loved. Money. Access granted. The screens on the wall flickered to life. A grid of 16 cameras showed every corner of the house. I saw the kitchen covered in filth. I saw Brandon passed out on the sofa in the living room, his mouth open, drooling onto a silk cushion. But it was the feed from the master bedroom marked Camera 1 that stopped my heart. I clicked on the playback history. I scrolled back to yesterday afternoon. The timestamp showed 2 p.m. The door to the bedroom opened. Vanessa walked in. She was not alone. Following her was a man I recognized instantly. It was the lead attorney for the Falcon Group, the very man negotiating the purchase of my company. I watched in silent horror as they engaged in an act of betrayal that went far deeper than corporate espionage. They fell onto the bed. My bed. The bed where I had held Eleanor as she took her last breath. They laughed as they undressed, kicking my wife's handmade quilt onto the floor. I gripped the edge of the desk so hard my knuckles turned white. This was not just adultery. This was a conspiracy. She was sleeping with the enemy to ensure the sale went through. She was selling my son out in the boardroom and cheating on him in the bedroom. I plugged my flash drive into the terminal. I selected the video file. The progress bar crawled across the screen. Downloading. Every percentage point was a bullet in the gun I would put to her head. I watched the screen one last time. Vanessa was smiling at her lover, tracing a finger down his chest. She looked triumphant. She looked untouchable. I pulled the drive out. I had the will. I had the medical records. And now I had the video that would destroy her reputation forever. I stood up, leaving the server room exactly as I found it. I was leaving the house, but I was taking the truth with me. And the truth was a bomb waiting to explode. I secured the flash drive in my pocket right next to Eleanor's will and moved towards the service exit. My heart was pounding a rhythm against my ribs that felt dangerous for a man of my age, but the adrenaline was the only thing keeping me upright. I reached for the handle of the back door, but froze as a wash of bright white light swept across the kitchen windows. Headlights. A car had just pulled into the driveway. Vanessa was back. She must have forgotten something, or perhaps her paranoia had driven her home early to check on her empire of lies. I heard the front door verify her biometric scan with a cheerful electronic chirp, followed immediately by the sound of her heels clacking aggressively on the foyer marble. I was trapped. If I went out the back now, the sensor would alert her. If I stayed, I was dead. I retreated into the shadows of the pantry, holding my breath. I heard her pause in the hallway. Then came the scream. It was not a scream of fear, but of fury. "Who is here?" she yelled. She had seen the mud I tracked in on the pristine carpet. She had seen the disturbance in the library. Suddenly, the house erupted. She had hit the panic button. A deafening siren began to wail, causing the walls to vibrate, and the emergency floodlights in the garden flickered to life, turning the night into a blinding stage. I had no choice. I kicked open the back door, shattering the lock I had installed myself 10 years ago, and sprinted into the yard. The cold air hit my lungs like broken glass. I ran past the rose bushes I had planted for my wife, the thorns tearing at my gray jumpsuit, like claws trying to hold me back. My bad hip screamed in protest with every stride, but I forced my legs to pump. I could hear Vanessa shouting orders behind me, likely into her phone, summoning the private security patrol that circled the neighborhood. I reached the perimeter wall. It was 8 feet of brick topped with decorative iron spikes. Impossible to climb. I looked left, then right. The heavy wooden gate was electronically locked. I was a rat in a bucket, and the cat was closing in. Then I saw it. In the far corner behind the overgrown hydrangeas was a small gap in the foundations, where the soil had eroded. It was a drainage ditch, barely wide enough for a large dog. The sound of heavy boots crunching on gravel echoed from the side of the house. Security was here. I threw my dignity into the dirt. I dropped to my stomach and crawled into the mud. The stench of wet earth and rotting leaves filled my nose. I pushed myself through the narrow opening, the rough concrete scraping the skin off my shoulders. My jumpsuit snagged on a root, and I had to rip it free, tearing the fabric. Here I was, Conrad Sullivan, the man who built half the skyline, crawling through the mud like a vermin to escape the house I paid for. I squeezed through the other side, tumbling into the drainage ditch of the public road. I lay there panting, covered in slime, my body shaking violently. I pulled myself deep into the tall grass, just as a flashlight beam swept over the wall above me. I heard Vanessa's voice, shrill and manic, drifting over the bricks. "They got away," she screamed. "Search the perimeter. Someone was in the safe. I want them found, and I want them broken." She did not say my name. She did not say Conrad. She thought it was a common thief, a burglar. She did not know that the thief was her father-in-law, and that he had just crawled through hell to bring back the fire that would burn her world to ash. I checked my pocket. The drive was safe. The will was safe. I wiped the mud from my face and limped into the darkness. The rat had escaped, and he still had his teeth. The sun had barely risen over the Chicago skyline, but the shadows in the lower-level parking garage of Sullivan Tower remained deep and cold. I had returned to the building despite the danger, because disappearing now would only confirm Vanessa's suspicions. I had to play the part of the ignorant janitor one last time. But as I walked past a row of concrete pillars clutching my side where the previous night's escape had scraped my skin raw, I realized that Vanessa was done playing games. 2 men stepped out from the darkness behind a parked delivery van. They were not company security. They were street thugs wearing heavy leather jackets and ski masks. They did not speak. They did not ask for my wallet. They simply moved toward me with the synchronized menace of paid professionals. I dropped my cleaning bucket, the plastic clattering loudly in the empty garage. I raised my fists, falling into a defensive stance I had learned at Paris Island 50 years ago. But my mind was faster than my body. The first attacker swung a heavy baton. I managed to dodge the initial blow, but the second man was already behind me. He kicked the back of my knees, and my legs, which were already exhausted from the night's exertion, buckled. I hit the concrete hard. Before I could scramble up, a steel-toed boot slammed into my ribcage. The sound was sickening, a dry, sharp crack that echoed in my own skull. The pain was immediate and blinding, white-hot and paralyzing. It felt as if a jagged knife had been driven into my chest. I curled into a ball, trying to protect my vital organs, gasping for air that refused to enter my lungs. Another kick landed on my shoulder and another on my thigh. They were not trying to kill me. They were trying to maim me. They were delivering a message written in bruises and broken bones. I knew that if I continued to fight back, they would escalate. They might accidentally kill me or put me in a coma, and I needed to be awake for the gala. I had to use my only remaining advantage, my frailty. I let my body go completely limp. I released the tension in my muscles and allowed my head to loll back against the oil-stained floor. I stopped groaning. I played dead. "Hold up," the larger man grunted, breathing heavily. He kicked my boot, but I did not react. "I think he is out," the boss said. "Break him, not bury him. Let's go." The silence that followed was heavy. I lay there listening to the blood rushing in my ears, waiting for the sound of their retreating footsteps. But the leader crouched down beside me. He grabbed a handful of my gray hair and lifted my head. "Listen to me, old man," he hissed, his breath smelling of stale tobacco. "You go near that house again, and next time we do not stop." I forced my swollen eyes to open just a slit. I had to make them believe I was finished. I had to make Vanessa lower her guard completely. I grabbed the man's wrist with a weak, trembling grip. I coughed, and a speck of blood landed on his glove. "Tell her," I whispered, my voice barely a wheeze. "Tell my daughter-in-law. She wins. Tell her I will be dead soon anyway." The thug laughed, a cruel sound of dismissal. He dropped my head back onto the concrete and wiped his glove on his jeans. "You got that right, Grandpa." I watched through half-closed lids as they walked away, disappearing into the stairwell. I lay alone on the cold floor, clutching my broken ribs. The pain was excruciating, but inside my chest, beneath the fractured bone, my heart was beating with a steady, terrifying rhythm. They thought I was asking for mercy. They did not understand that a man who knows he is going to die has nothing left to fear. I was not dying. I was just getting started. The steady, rhythmic beep of the heart monitor was the only sound in the private hospital room. It was a monotonous countdown, measuring the seconds of a life my son wished would simply end. I lay there, with my chest heavily bandaged, every breath sending a sharp spike of agony through my fractured ribs. The painkillers made the room spin, but my mind remained lucid, sharp, and focused on the door. When it finally opened, it was not a nurse coming to check my vitals. It was Brandon. He did not bring flowers. He did not bring a get-well card. He walked in with a leather portfolio tucked under his arm and a look of supreme annoyance on his face, as if my hospitalization was an inconvenience to his schedule. He stood over my bed, looking down at me with cold, dead eyes. "You look terrible, Dad," he said flatly. "But I suppose you earned it. You should have stayed away from the house." He threw a thick document onto the rolling tray table and shoved it over my lap. The movement jarred the bed and I gasped in pain. Brandon ignored it. "Sign this," he commanded, uncapping a gold fountain pen and holding it out to me. "It is a waiver of executive privilege. It states that due to your declining health, you are voluntarily transferring your remaining voting rights to me, effective immediately. I need a unanimous shareholder vote to finalize the sale to Falcon tomorrow. You are the only loose end." I looked at the paper. It was my death warrant as a businessman. I looked up at him and wheezed, my voice barely a whisper. "I will never sign that. You will not destroy my company." Brandon's face darkened. The mask of civility slipped. He reached out and grabbed the clear plastic oxygen tube running to my nose. He pinched it tight, cutting off the airflow. My lungs burned. I tried to reach up to stop him, but my arms were too weak. He leaned in close, his cologne overpowering the smell of the hospital. "Listen to me, old man," he hissed. "You are in a private room. No cameras. No nurses for another hour. If I hold this tube for 2 minutes, you drift off into a coma. Then you die. And the doctors will just say your old heart finally gave out. Do you want to die here today? Or do you want to sign the paper and live long enough to see me rich?" I stared into his eyes. I saw no hesitation. He was ready to kill me. He was ready to commit patricide for money. The last ember of fatherly love I held for him extinguished in that moment. I tapped his hand weakly. He released the tube, and I sucked in a desperate gulp of air, coughing violently. "Give me the pen," I rasped. "You win." He smirked, triumphant and arrogant. I knew you would see reason. I took the pen, my hand trembling violently. I looked at the signature line. This was the moment. If I signed my legal name, the company was gone. But I remembered a lesson from my banking days. A signature signed under duress or with a specific variance is invalid. I put the pen to the paper. I wrote Conrad Sullivan, but I deliberately changed the loop of the letter S and omitted my middle initial entirely. To Brandon, it looked like the shaky scrawl of a dying man. To a forensic accountant, it was a forgery. I dropped the pen. Brandon snatched the paper, checking the signature. He smiled, patting my shoulder with mock affection. Good boy. Now get some rest, Dad. We have a big day tomorrow. He walked out, whistling. He thought he had just won the kingdom. He did not know he had just walked into a legal minefield that would blow his legs off. The glow of the tablet screen was the only light in my darkened hospital room, illuminating the sterile walls with a harsh blue hue. I was supposed to be resting, supposed to be drifting into a drug-induced oblivion, while my body knit itself back together. Instead, I was watching a live broadcast on social media. My son and his wife were not just celebrating their victory, they were broadcasting it to the world. They were sitting in the living room of my penthouse, the very room where I used to read bedtime stories to Brandon. But there were no stories tonight, only bottles of vintage Dom Perignon that cost more than my nurse's annual salary. Vanessa held the camera, her face flushed with alcohol and triumph. She panned around the room, showing off the view of the city, showing off the signed contracts that were spread across the coffee table like trophies of war. Then she turned the lens to Brandon. He was lounging on my leather recliner, a cigar in one hand and a crystal glass in the other. He looked sloppy. He looked weak, but mostly he looked cruel. Say hello to your fans, Brandon. Vanessa giggled, her voice shrill and distorted by the speakers. Tell them the good news. Tell them about the old regime. Brandon took a long drag of the cigar and blew smoke directly into the camera lens. We are finally free, baby, he slurred. The papers are signed, the deal is done. And the best part is, the old man is safely tucked away in a hospital bed, probably drooling on his pillow right now. He paused and laughed a sound that curdled the blood in my veins. To Conrad Sullivan, the man who built the empire just so I could sell it. Thanks for the cash, Dad. Try not to die before the check clears. Vanessa squealed with delight, clinking her glass against his. To the nursing home, she cheered. May he rest in peace, or at least in silence. I stared at the screen, watching the comments roll in from their sycophantic friends, laughing emojis, and congratulations on their newfound wealth. They thought I was a corpse waiting to be buried. They thought I was a senile old fool who had been beaten into submission. They did not see the man watching them from the darkness. They did not see the rage that was transforming my pain into power. I looked at the IV line running into the back of my hand. The clear fluid dripping into my veins was meant to keep me sedated, meant to keep me compliant. I did not need sedation. I needed clarity. I reached over with my other hand gripping the plastic tube. My skin was bruised, my knuckles were swollen, but my grip was iron. I did not hesitate. I ripped the needle out in one smooth, violent motion. A line of dark blood welled up on my hand, trickling down to stain the white hospital sheets. The sting was sharp and grounding. It woke me up. I tossed the plastic tubing onto the floor, watching the sedative pool on the linoleum. The heart monitor began to beep rapidly, sensing the distress, but I reached over and silenced it. I swung my legs over the side of the bed. My broken ribs screamed in protest, a symphony of agony that threatened to buckle my knees. I grit my teeth, forcing the air into my lungs, forcing my body to obey my will. I stood up, swaying slightly in the dim light. I caught my reflection in the window. I looked like a ghost, pale and battered in a hospital gown. But in my eyes, the ghost was gone. The soldier was back. I wiped the blood from my hand onto the gown, leaving a red streak like war paint. Enjoy your champagne, I whispered to the frozen image of my laughing son on the tablet. Drink it all, because it is the last thing you will ever taste as a rich man. It is time to go to work. The freight elevator of the hospital smelled of antiseptic and rotting flowers, but to me it smelled like freedom. I slipped out through the loading dock, wearing a trench coat I had pilfered from the lost and found to cover my blood-stained hospital gown. The night air was freezing against my bare legs, but the cold was a welcome shock to my system, keeping me alert, keeping the pain in my ribs at a manageable dull roar. I did not go home. I went to the one place where loyalty still existed. Lawrence's private office was a fortress of mahogany and leather located in a quiet brownstone on the north side. When I walked in, Lawrence dropped his scotch glass. It shattered on the floor, but he didn't notice. He was staring at my pale face and the red stain slowly blossoming on my side. Sitting in the corner in the shadows was Chief Miller, the head of the city police and a man I had served with in the trenches of business and life for 40 years. He did not look shocked. He looked ready. We laid it out on the desk. It was not a collection of papers, it was an arsenal. The medical records proving the fake pregnancy. The thumb drive containing the video of Vanessa's infidelity. The original will of my wife that proved Brandon stole his inheritance. And finally, the waiver I had signed in the hospital with the forged signature. We arranged them like knives on a butcher block. Lawrence ran his hands through his hair, his face pale. "This is airtight, Conrad," he said, his voice shaking. "We have enough here to put Vanessa away for 20 years and strip Brandon of every dime. But we can file this tomorrow. We can let the police handle the arrest. Look at you, you are gray, you are bleeding. If you walk into that gala tonight, the adrenaline alone might stop your heart. You need a doctor, not a showdown." I looked at Lawrence and then at the garment bag hanging on the back of his door. It contained my tuxedo, the one I had worn to accept the Businessman of the Year award 10 years ago. It was a suit of armor from a time when I was a king, not a janitor. I walked over to it, ignoring the screaming protest of my broken ribs. I unzipped the bag. The black fabric was pristine, sharp, and commanding. I began to dress. I stripped off the hospital gown and the stolen coat, letting them fall to the floor like a shed skin. I pulled on the crisp white shirt, buttoning it over my bruised chest. I tied the bow tie with fingers that were steady and sure. I slid into the jacket. It fit perfectly. The janitor was gone. The victim was gone. In the mirror, Conrad Sullivan stared back. Lawrence grabbed my arm. "Conrad, please listen to reason. You are physically incapable of doing this. You will collapse on that stage." I pulled my arm away gently but firmly. I adjusted my cufflinks, gold squares that had belonged to my father. I looked Lawrence in the eye and then nodded to the chief, who stood up and unholstered his service weapon, checking the chamber. "I do not need health, Lawrence," I said, my voice low and gravelly, like a storm rolling in. "Health is for men who have a future. I have a mission. I do not care if my heart stops 5 minutes after I walk off that stage. But until then, it will beat for one thing only. I do not need health. I need justice. Let us go." The party is starting. The grand ballroom of the Sullivan Tower was vibrating with the hum of a string quartet and the murmur of 300 wealthy guests. I stood high above them in the darkened lighting booth, gazing down through the tinted glass like a gargoyle perched on a cathedral. I was dressed in my tuxedo, my ribs bound tightly beneath the starch of my shirt, but I was not yet ready to reveal myself. First, I had to soften the target. I had to introduce a ghost into the festivities. I watched through a pair of opera glasses as a waiter I had bribed earlier that evening navigated the crowd. He carried a small, elegant black box tied with a silver ribbon. It looked like a jewelry box, the kind that holds a Rolex or a diamond bracelet. The waiter found Brandon standing near the bar. My son looked dashing in his custom tuxedo, But even from this distance I could see the sheen of sweat on his forehead. He was drinking scotch as if it were water, his eyes darting around the room with the nervous energy of an imposter waiting to be exposed. The waiter presented the box. Brandon took it, his ego instantly inflating. He smiled tightly, assuming it was a tribute from an admirer or perhaps a signing bonus from the Falcon Group. He excused himself from the group of investors he was boring and stepped into the shadow of a large marble pillar to open his gift in private. I adjusted the focus on my glasses. I saw his fingers pull the ribbon. He lifted the lid. He reached inside. He did not pull out gold or silver. He pulled out a white plastic stick, a pregnancy test. I had carefully drawn 2 pink lines on it with a marker in the car. Beneath it in the box lay a grainy ultrasound picture of a fetus that I had downloaded from the internet. Brandon froze. The glass of scotch in his other hand tilted dangerously, spilling amber liquid onto the expensive carpet. He stared at the object in his hand as if he were holding a live grenade. I could see his lips moving. He was saying her name. Vanessa. Confusion and terror washed over his face. He looked across the room to where Vanessa was holding court, surrounded by admirers. She looked radiant, slim, and drinking champagne. The disconnect shattered him. If she was pregnant, why was she drinking? If she was pregnant, why hadn't she told him? And the darker thought, the one I knew, was festering in his insecure mind. If she was pregnant, was it even his? He shoved the test and the photo into his pocket, looking around wildly to see if anyone had witnessed the moment. He looked trapped. The arrogance he had worn like a suit of armor 5 minutes ago was gone. In its place was the face of a scared little boy who was drowning in secrets. He grabbed a fresh bottle of whiskey from a passing tray and didn't bother with a glass, taking a swig straight from the neck. His hands were shaking so badly the bottle rattled against his teeth. The seed was planted. He was no longer thinking about the merger. He was no longer thinking about the speech he had to give. He was thinking about lies. He was thinking about the baby he thought he lost 2 years ago and the impossibility of the one in his pocket now. He was mentally crumbling brick by brick just minutes before the curtain was set to rise. I lowered the glasses and checked my watch. The psychological artillery had done its damage. It was time for the infantry to take the field. The orchestra swelled, playing a waltz that sounded more like a dirge to my ears. Below me, the cream of Chicago society swirled in a kaleidoscope of diamonds and silk. I saw faces I had known for decades. Men I had played golf with, men I had loaned money to, men who had sworn loyalty to the Sullivan name. Tonight, they were here to watch it die. They held their crystal flutes and smiled, their practiced smiles buzzing with the gossip of the sale. They were not here to celebrate a legacy. They were here to witness a carcass being picked clean. And in the center of the room, holding court like a monarch, was Vanessa. She wore a gown of shimmering silver that clung to her body like a second skin, catching the light of the chandeliers with every movement. She looked magnificent. She looked expensive. She moved from group to group, touching arms, laughing at jokes that were not funny, whispering promises she had no intention of keeping. She was radiant with the glow of absolute victory. She had no idea that the foundation she was standing on was made of sand, and I was about to bring the tide. I watched her approach the table where the executives from the Falcon Group sat. The buyers. The enemy. She shook hands with the CEO, a man named Sterling, who had been trying to bankrupt me for 20 years. They exchanged a look that made my stomach turn. It was a look of conspirators sharing a secret joke. They toasted to the future. A future where my name was scrubbed from the building and replaced with theirs. Brandon was nowhere near her. He was lurking near the periphery, leaning against a marble column, still clutching his glass of whiskey. He watched his wife with haunted eyes, his hand occasionally drifting to his pocket, where the fake pregnancy test burned against his leg. The distance between them was a chasm filled with lies and unspoken accusations. The cracks in their perfect facade were beginning to show, but only I could see them. To the rest of the room, they were the golden couple about to cash out. The music faded slightly, and the lights dimmed. A hush fell over the crowd. It was time. The main event was beginning. At the far end of the hall, two liveried staff members began to push the massive double doors shut. The heavy oak boomed as it met the frame sealing the room. The sound echoed like a judge's gavel. "Lock them in," I whispered to the darkness. No one leaves. No one escapes. The exits were blocked. The players were on stage, and the script they were about to read was not the one they had rehearsed. I adjusted my cufflinks and took a step toward the spiral staircase that led down to the stage. The party had officially begun. A single spotlight cut through the darkness of the ballroom, illuminating Vanessa as she stepped up to the microphone. She looked like a silver statue, flawless and cold. The room fell into a respectful silence, broken only by the clinking of crystal and the rustle of expensive silk. I stood in the shadows of the wings, my hand resting on the heavy velvet curtain, waiting for my cue. I watched as she adjusted the microphone stand, her diamond bracelets catching the light. She took a deep breath, composing her face into a mask of mournful dignity. She was a natural performer. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice soft and trembling with practiced emotion. "Tonight is a bittersweet celebration. We are here to usher Sullivan Construction into a new era with our partners at Falcon, but we are also here to honor the past." She paused, looking out over the crowd with misty eyes. "Many of you have asked about Conrad, my father-in-law, the man who started it all." She sighed, a sound that was amplified through the massive speakers. "It breaks my heart to tell you that Conrad could not be here tonight. As many of you know, his health has declined rapidly over the last 2 years. The mind is a fragile thing. It is a tragedy to watch a giant fade away, but we must accept it." I felt a vein throb in my temple. She was not just writing me out of the company, she was writing me out of reality. She was burying a living man with words of fake compassion. "He is safe," she continued, a tear sliding perfectly down her cheek. "He is in a wonderful facility in Florida, where he receives round-the-clock care. He spends his days gardening and looking at the ocean. He is happy even if he no longer remembers us, even if he no longer remembers his own name. We carry the burden of his memory for him. We made the hard choice to take over the company to protect his legacy from his own confusion. We did it out of love." The audience murmured with sympathy. I saw men I had known for 40 years nodding their heads, wiping their eyes, believing every poisoned word. They thought I was a senile invalid drooling in a nursing home. Brandon stood behind her, looking at his shoes, unable to face the lie he was co-signing. Vanessa raised her champagne flute high into the spotlight. "So please raise your glasses. To Conrad Sullivan. May he find peace in his twilight years. And to us, to the future, to a new beginning." 300 arms raised in unison. A chorus of "To Conrad" echoed through the hall. It was a toast to my demise. Vanessa smiled, drinking deep from her glass, looking like the cat who had finally swallowed the canary. She lowered the glass, basking in the applause, preparing to signal the signing of the contract. Now I whispered into my lapel microphone. The world went black. The spotlight died instantly, plunging the ballroom into absolute darkness. The applause faltered and died, replaced by confused murmurs and the sound of glass breaking. The music cut out with a screech of feedback. For 10 seconds there was nothing but the terrified breathing of the wealthy in the dark. Then a low electrical hum began to vibrate through the floor. It grew louder, a deep bass thrum that rattled the teeth. Suddenly, the massive LED screen behind the stage, which had been displaying the company logo, flickered to life. It did not show a logo. It exploded with blinding white static that illuminated the confused faces of the crowd like a lightning bolt. Vanessa spun around, shielding her eyes from the glare. The static cleared. The show was about to begin. The heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom did not just open, they exploded inward as if kicked by a giant. The sound cracked through the silence like a gunshot, making half the guests jump in their seats. A beam of white light from the hallway cut through the darkness of the room, creating a long, luminous path that led directly to the stage. And standing at the head of that path was not a nurse from Florida. It was me. I stood framed in this doorway, my tuxedo sharp and black against the light. I was not alone. To my right stood Lawrence, clutching a briefcase that contained the end of their world. To my left stood 4 federal agents in windbreakers, their badges glinting under the hallway lights. We were not guests. We were an invasion force. I began to walk. My steps were slow and deliberate. Click, click, click. The sound of my dress shoes on the parquet floor echoed in the cavernous silence. The crowd parted before me like the Red Sea. Men who had toasted my memory 5 minutes ago now scrambled back in their chairs, spilling wine and knocking over glasses, their faces pale with shock. They whispered my name as I passed. Conrad. It is Conrad. He looks alive. He looks furious. I locked eyes with the stage. Vanessa stood frozen by the podium, her mouth slightly open, her hand still raised in that toast to my demise. She looked like a deer caught in the headlights of a semi-truck. She blinked rapidly, trying to process the impossibility of what she was seeing. The senile old man she had mocked, the janitor she had humiliated, was walking towards her with the stride of the executioner. But it was Brandon who broke first. He was standing near the edge of the stage, staring at me with eyes so wide they showed white all around. He began to shake. It started in his hands and spread to his whole body. The crystal tumbler of whiskey he had been clutching slipped from his sweaty fingers. It hit the floor with a shatter that sounded deafening in the quiet room. Shards of glass and amber liquid exploded across his shoes, but he did not move. He did not breathe. He just mouthed the word, "Dad," over and over again. I reached the stairs to the stage. My broken ribs burned with every step, a fire in my chest that kept me sharp. I walked past Brandon without looking at him. I walked up to Vanessa. The smell of her expensive perfume was choked by the scent of her fear. Up close, I could see the makeup cracking along her smile lines. She tried to speak, to say something to stop me, but no sound came out. I reached out and gently took the microphone from her trembling hand. I tapped it twice. Thump, thump. The sound boomed through the speakers, waking the room from its trance. I looked out at the sea of faces, at the bankers and the lawyers and the vultures who had come to pick my bones. Then I turned to look directly at Vanessa. "I am sorry to disappoint you," I said, my voice steady and cold as a winter wind. "As you can see, I am not in Florida. I am not gardening, and I most certainly have not lost my mind." I took a step closer to her, forcing her to retreat until her back hit the projection screen. "I am very much alive, Vanessa, but looking at the evidence I have brought with me tonight, I would say that you are the one whose life is about to end." I pointed the small remote control I held in my hand at the screen behind Vanessa. "Let us start with the foundation of your lies," I said into the microphone. "The tragedy that broke my son's heart and sent me to prison for 2 years. You remember that day, don't you, Vanessa? The blood on the stairs, the tears in court, the tiny white coffin you made us bury." I pressed the button. The massive LED screen flashed and then resolved into a high-resolution image of a document. It was a medical record from St. Mary's Hospital in Boston, dated 5 years ago. The text was blown up large enough for the people in the back row to read without their glasses. The room gasped as one. It was a collective intake of breath that sucked the air out of the ballroom. Patient Vanessa Sullivan. Procedure: total hysterectomy. Removal of the uterus and cervix. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the crowd, turning into a roar of whispered shock. Women were covering their mouths. Men were shaking their heads. I watched Brandon. He was staring up at the screen, his neck craning, his mouth open in a silent scream. He read the words over and over again, trying to make them make sense. He looked at Vanessa, then back at the screen, then down at his own shaking hands. "No," he whispered, his voice lost in the noise. "No. That is not right. We saw the ultrasound. We saw the baby." He took a stumbling step toward her, his face a mask of utter devastation. "Vanessa, tell them it is a lie. Tell them he forged it." Vanessa did not speak. She was pressed against the screen, her own medical history illuminated on her back like a scarlet letter. She looked small, defeated. The lie she had built her life around, the lie that had given her power over my family, had just collapsed in high definition. "If she had no uterus," I shouted over the crowd, my voice cutting through the chaos, "how could she have been pregnant 3 years later? How could she have lost a baby that never existed?" Brandon grabbed her shoulders, shaking her violently. "Answer him," he screamed, tears streaming down his face. "Was it real? Was our baby real? Or was it all a lie?" She looked at him, and the truth was in her eyes. It was cold and hollow. "It was a performance," Vanessa whispered, her voice barely audible. "It was all a performance, Brandon. I needed you to marry me. I needed you to hate your father. I needed control." Brandon released her as if she were burning him. He staggered back, his legs hitting the podium. He looked at me standing there in my tuxedo, the man he had branded a monster. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He had testified against me. He had locked me away. He had destroyed our relationship. And he had done it all for a woman who had played him for the biggest fool in Chicago. He looked at me, and I saw the boy I used to know, the boy who was lost and broken and begging for forgiveness that I did not have in me to give. But lies about biology were not enough for you, Vanessa. You needed insurance. You needed to make sure the sale went through no matter what, because you had already spent the commission in your head. I looked at Brandon, who was slumped against the podium, looking like a man who had been shot in the gut. "You might forgive a lie about a child, Brandon, because you are soft. But let us see if you can forgive this." I pressed the button on the remote for the second time. The medical records vanished from the giant screen, replaced by the time-stamped video footage from the hidden camera in the master bedroom. The image was crystal clear. It showed my bed, the bed where my wife and I had shared 40 years of marriage. And on it, tangled in the sheets, was Vanessa. She was not alone. The camera zoomed in digitally. The man with her turned his face toward the lens, laughing at something she whispered. A ripple of recognition went through the crowd like an electric shock. It was not some random lover. It was Marcus Sterling, the lead attorney for the Falcon Group, the very man sitting at the front table holding a contract to buy my company. The audio from the video boomed through the speakers. "Do not worry about Brandon," Marcus said on the screen, his hand running through Vanessa's hair. "The idiot will sign whatever you put in front of him. He is desperate to please you." And Vanessa laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. "He is pathetic," she purred. "Once we get the wire transfer, I am divorcing him. I will take half and we can finally go to Monaco." The ballroom erupted. This was not just adultery. This was corporate espionage. This was a conspiracy to defraud. The guests turned to look at the Falcon table where Marcus Sterling was trying to hide his face behind a napkin, his face pale as death. Vanessa snapped. The cool composure she had maintained for years shattered instantly. She let out a feral scream, a sound of pure animal panic. "Turn it off!" she shrieked, lunging toward the laptop connected to the projector. "That is private. That is illegal." She ran across the stage, her silver dress flying behind her, her face twisted into a mask of ugly desperation. She reached for the cables, her nails extended like claws ready to rip the truth out of the wall. But she never made it. One of the federal agents stepped forward. He did not speak. He simply extended a massive arm and blocked her path. She slammed into him and bounced back, falling hard onto the wooden stage. She scrambled up, looking for an escape, looking for an ally, but there were none. She looked out at the audience. The adoration she had basked in 10 minutes ago was gone. In its place was pure, unadulterated disgust. The women who had envied her style now looked at her like she was something they had stepped in. The men who had admired her beauty now saw only a cheap con artist. Her social capital, the only currency she truly cared about, had been devalued to zero in 60 seconds. She stood there panting, her hair disheveled, exposed as an adulteress and a traitor in front of the people she had tried so hard to impress. I looked down at her and spoke into the microphone. You wanted to be the center of attention, Vanessa. Well, look around. Everyone is watching you now. The video of the affair faded to black, leaving the audience in a state of stunned silence, but we were not done. Emotional betrayal is a sin, but stealing money is a felony. I nodded to Lawrence. He stepped out from the shadows, his briefcase open, his face grim. He walked to the microphone and placed a stack of papers on the podium next to the trembling form of my son. He did not look at the crowd. He looked at the federal agents standing at the edge of the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, Lawrence said, his voice projecting clear and sharp. You have seen the moral bankruptcy of this administration. Now look at the financial bankruptcy. He signaled the technician. The screen behind us shifted again. This time, it displayed a complex web of wire transfers and offshore accounts. The numbers were staggering. Red columns of debt and green columns of illicit payments illuminated the ballroom. Here is the forensic audit of the last 24 months, Lawrence explained, pointing to the figures. $5 million diverted to a shell company in the Cayman Islands registered to Vanessa Sullivan. $2 million in kickbacks from substandard material suppliers. And here is the loan application that supposedly funded the company expansion. It bears Conrad Sullivan's signature. But as you can see from the date stamp on this digital file, the document was created and signed electronically from an IP address located inside this building while Conrad was under anesthesia in a hospital bed. The crowd gasped again. This was the smoking gun. This was proof of grand larceny and identity theft. The whispers turned into a roar of condemnation. The wealthy elite of Chicago knew how to forgive a lot of things, but they did not forgive stealing. Chief Miller stepped forward. He walked up the stairs, the heavy thud of his boots sounding like the drumbeat of doom. He pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket. It was an arrest warrant signed by a federal judge less than an hour ago. He approached Vanessa, who was backing away until she hit the edge of the proscenium. Vanessa Sullivan, he said, his voice flat and professional. You are under arrest for embezzlement, wire fraud, corporate espionage, and identity theft. Two agents moved in behind him. The metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the microphone. They grabbed Vanessa's wrists, pulling her arms behind her back. The touch of the cold steel seemed to snap the last thread of her sanity. She began to struggle, kicking and twisting in her shimmering silver gown like a fish caught in a net. No, she screamed, her voice shrill and breaking. You cannot do this. I am the CEO. I am a Sullivan. Let me go. She looked frantically around the room, searching for a savior, but finding only cold stares. Then her eyes landed on Brandon. He was still standing there, paralyzed, a broken man watching his world burn. Vanessa's face twisted into a mask of pure venom. She stopped fighting the agents and lunged toward her husband, spitting the words at him. It was him, she shrieked, pointing a manicured finger at Brandon. He made me do it. It was his idea. He told me to forge the signature. He told me to fake the pregnancy so his father would go to jail. I was just following orders. I am a victim here. Arrest him. Arrest Brandon. The crowd watched in horrified fascination as the woman who had claimed to be the matriarch of the family tried to sacrifice her own husband to save her skin. Brandon looked at her, the woman he had betrayed his father, for the woman he had sold his soul to please. He saw her now for what she truly was, a parasite who would eat him alive to survive another day. The agents dragged her toward the stairs, her heels dragging on the floor, her screams echoing off the high ceiling. The rats were finally turning on each other. The ballroom was in chaos, but the war was not quite over. Vanessa was being dragged out in handcuffs, but the sharks from the Falcon Group were still circling. Marcus Sterling, the man I had just exposed as my daughter-in-law's lover, wiped the sweat from his forehead and stood up. He was desperate. He had millions of dollars in bonuses riding on this acquisition, and he was not going to let a little thing like felony fraud stand in his way. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out the contract, the one I had signed in the hospital bed only 24 hours ago. "Hold on," he shouted, his voice trying to regain some authority over the murmuring crowd. "This is all very dramatic, Conrad, but it changes nothing about the sale. We have a binding contract. You signed it. Your son signed it. The transfer of ownership is legal. We own this building. We own this company. And we will sue you into oblivion if you try to back out now." He waved the document in the air like a sword. Brandon looked up, his eyes flickering with a tiny spark of hope. If the sale went through, he would still get his money. He would still be rich even if he was alone. I looked down at Sterling with a pitying smile. I signaled Lawrence one last time. "Put the signature page on the screen," I commanded. The image on the massive LED wall shifted. It zoomed in on the bottom of the contract where the ink was still fresh. There was Brandon's signature, arrogant and sprawling, and below it was mine, shaky and weak. I leaned into the microphone. "You are a terrible lawyer, Marcus. You were so busy sleeping with my daughter-in-law that you forgot to do your due diligence. Look closely at that signature." I pointed to the screen. "My legal name as stated in the corporate charter and on every official document since 1972 is Conrad Patrick Sullivan. My bylaws state clearly that any transfer of majority shares must be signed with my full legal name and notarized by a third-party witness." I paused, letting the silence stretch. Yesterday, in my hospital room, my son dismissed the notary because he wanted to threaten to cut off my oxygen supply. He forced me to sign under duress, which already voids the contract. But I also gave myself an insurance policy. Look at the name. The crowd squinted. The signature on the screen read simply Conrad Sullivan. No middle name, no initial. And the loop on the S was deliberately backwards, a specific tell I used to signal distress to my bankers. "That is not a valid signature," I boomed. "That is a forgery executed under threat of death. It is worth less than the paper it is printed on. The contract is void. The sale is dead. And Sullivan Construction still belongs to me." Sterling stared at the screen, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. He looked at the paper in his hand, then he looked at me. He realized he had been outplayed by the very man he dismissed as a relic. He didn't say a word. He simply crumpled the contract, dropped it into a half-empty champagne glass, and signaled his team to leave. They walked out, leaving a trail of defeat in their wake. I turned my gaze to Brandon. He was standing alone on the stage. The hope was gone. The money was gone. The wife was gone. He looked down at his hands, the hands that had tried to kill me, and then at the empty ballroom floor. He was not the heir to an empire anymore. He was just a man in a rented tuxedo with absolutely nothing to his name. I walked to the edge of the stage and looked down at him. "You wanted to inherit the world's sun. But you forgot that you have to be a man to hold it. Now get out of my building." The silence in the ballroom was heavy and suffocating. The police had dragged Vanessa away screaming, but her absence left a vacuum that was quickly filled by a different kind of horror. The guests were no longer looking at the stage with judgment. They were looking with pity and embarrassment. They were watching the final disintegration of a man who had once thought himself a king. Brandon stood alone in the center of the spotlight. The expensive tuxedo he wore now looked like a costume for a play that had been canceled. He looked at the exit where his wife had vanished. He looked at the table where the Falcon executives had sat. Then he looked at me. I saw the moment the reality crushed him. He realized he had no wife, he had no money, he had no career, and without me he had no identity. The arrogance drained out of him, leaving only a terrified child. He took a stumbling step toward me, then another. He did not walk like a man. He walked like a beggar. "Dad." He croaked, his voice cracking. He collapsed. He did not fall from exhaustion. He threw himself to the floor, sliding across the polished wood until he was at my feet. He reached out and wrapped his arms around my legs, burying his face in the fabric of my trousers. The smell of stale whiskey and expensive cologne wafted up from him, mixing with the scent of his fear. "Dad, please," he sobbed, his body shaking with violent convulsions. "You have to listen to me. It was her. It was all Vanessa. She bewitched me, Dad. She twisted my mind. I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted to sell the company. She forced me. She threatened to leave me if I did not do what she said. I am a victim too." I looked down at the top of his head. I watched his shoulders heave. I felt his tears soaking into the wool of the suit I had worn to battle for his future. A year ago, this sight would have broken my heart. A year ago, I would have knelt down and pulled him into my arms. I would have told him that we could fix it, that family comes first. But I was not the man I was a year ago. I was the man who had laid in a hospital bed yesterday while this weeping creature pinched my oxygen tube and told me to die. I was the man who had spent 2 years in a cage because of his testimony. I did not move. I did not pull away. I simply stood there like a statue carved from granite. "Dad, look at me," Brandon pleaded, looking up. His face was a mess of snot and tears, his eyes red and swollen. "I am your son. I am your boy. You cannot leave me with nothing. I have nowhere to go. I have no money. Please, Dad, just give me another chance. We can rebuild. We can be a family again. Just you and me." He was not sorry for what he had done. He was sorry that he had lost. He was not begging for forgiveness. He was begging for a lifeline. He was willing to throw the woman he claimed to love under the bus just to save his own skin. He was a coward of the highest order. I looked into his eyes, and I searched for any spark of the little boy I had raised. I looked for the son who used to sit on my lap and ask about how skyscrapers were built. But that boy was dead. He had been killed by greed and entitlement. In his place was a stranger, a weak and treacherous man who would sell me out again the moment the price was right. The crowd watched, holding their breath, waiting to see if the father would forgive the prodigal son. But there is a limit to love. There is a line where forgiveness becomes foolishness. I slowly pulled my leg from his grasp. He tried to hold on his fingers, clawing at the fabric, but I stepped back, leaving him clutching at empty air. I looked down at him, and my eyes held no anger, no hate, and no warmth. They were as cold and empty as the grave he had tried to put me in. The bond was severed. The ice had finally set. I stepped back from the grasping hands of the man who shared my DNA, adjusting my tuxedo jacket with a deliberate, slow movement. The silence in the room was absolute. 300 pairs of eyes were fixed on us, witnessing the final act of a tragedy that had been years in the making. Brandon knelt there on the stage, surrounded by the debris of his shattered life, looking up at me with the wet, desperate eyes of a dog waiting to be kicked. He expected anger. He expected shouting. But I gave him something far worse. I gave him the truth. "Stand up." I commanded, my voice low and devoid of warmth. "You look pathetic. And if there is one thing a Sullivan is not allowed to be, it is pathetic." Brandon scrambled to his feet, wiping his nose on his sleeve, trembling like a leaf in a storm. He looked at me with a glimmer of hope, thinking that my command was a sign of mercy. He was wrong. "You call me father now," I said, letting my voice carry to the back of the room. "You appeal to our blood now that your pockets are empty. But where was that loyalty yesterday when you tried to suffocate me in a hospital bed?" Where was that love when you testified against me in court? You are not my son, Brandon. You are just a man who shares my last name. And as of tonight, you do not even have that. I took a step closer to him and he flinched. Vanessa is going to prison, I continued. She is a criminal and she will pay her debt to society. But you are not a criminal. You are something much sadder. You are a coward. You let a woman manipulate you. You let greed blind you. You are too weak for prison, Brandon. So I am going to give you a different sentence. I pointed a finger at his chest, right over his heart. You are fired. Effective immediately. You are removed from the board. You are stripped of your title. You will not receive a severance package. You will not receive a reference. You are walking out of here with nothing but the clothes on your back. Brandon gasped, his face turning white. But Dad, he stammered. The debts. The loans I took out for the lifestyle. The house, if I lose the job, I lose everything. I will be on the street. That is not my problem, I replied, cold as ice. Those are your debts, Brandon. You spent the money, you enjoyed the champagne, now you can pay the tab. Do not come to my house, do not call my number. If you step foot in Sullivan Tower again, I will have you arrested for trespassing. I turned to the security team standing in the wings. 2 large men in dark suits stepped forward. They were the same guards who had watched Brandon throw me out of the building 2 years ago. They remembered. There was a grim satisfaction on their faces as they approached him. Get him out of my sight, I said, turning my back on him. No. Brandon screamed as the guards grabbed his arms. Dad, please. You cannot do this. I am your son. I am sorry. I stood still, listening to his screams fading as they dragged him across the stage. I watched him kicking and struggling, his heels skidding on the polished floor, exactly the way mine had when he ordered me removed. It was a perfect mirror, a perfect circle closing. The guards hauled him down the stairs and through the center aisle. The guests pulled away from him as if he were contagious. They dragged him to the great oak doors and threw him out into the cold Chicago night. The heavy doors boomed shut with a sound of finality. The room was silent again. I stood alone on the stage, the sole survivor of a war I never wanted to fight. I adjusted my cufflinks and looked out at the crowd. My chest ached. My heart was broken. But my conscience was clear. I had reclaimed my company. But tonight I had lost my son forever. The cleaning crew had gone, leaving the scent of lemon polish to mask the lingering smell of Brandon's desperation. I sat alone in the executive chair, the leather groaning softly as I leaned back. It was 3:00 in the morning. The city of Chicago lay spread out beneath me, a grid of amber lights and moving shadows. But for the first time in 2 years, the view belonged to me again. The office, however, did not feel like mine. Vanessa had stripped it of its soul, replacing my mahogany bookshelves with cold glass and filling the walls with abstract art that cost more than a house. I stood up, ignoring the dull throb in my mending ribs, and walked to the fireplace. Above the mantel, where a portrait of my father used to hang there, was now a massive stylized painting of Vanessa. It depicted her as a modern queen looking down on the world with a sneer of superiority. I reached up and pulled it from the wall. The frame was heavy gold leaf over cheap wood, much like the woman herself. I did not hesitate. I smashed the corner of the frame against the marble hearth, cracking the wood. Then I ripped the canvas from its backing. I crumpled the painted face of my daughter-in-law into a ball and tossed it into the fireplace. I took a box of matches from my pocket, the same matches I had used to light the boiler in the basement when I was a janitor. I struck one. The flame flared to life, a tiny beacon of cleansing fire. I tossed it onto the canvas. The oil paint caught, quickly hissing and popping as the chemicals burned. I watched her smile curl and blacken, turning into ash. I watched her eyes, the eyes that had looked at me with such contempt, dissolve into smoke that was sucked up the chimney. I poured myself a drink. Not champagne, just water. I sat back down and listened to the silence. It was heavy. There was no laughter in the hallways. There was no family to share this victory with. My wife was dead. My son was dead to me. My legacy was safe, but my bloodline had ended. A wave of profound loneliness washed over me, a tide of grief for the life I thought I was building. But as I watched the last embers of the painting fade, I realized something. This silence was not empty. It was clean. It was the silence of a room that had been purged of a disease. I was alone, yes, but I was no longer a prisoner in my own home. I was no longer a victim waiting for the next blow. This was the loneliness of the mountaintop. It was cold, and the air was thin, but the view was limitless. It was the loneliness of freedom. I reached for the phone on the desk. It was the old landline, the one that was secure. I dialed a number I knew by heart, even at this ungodly hour. It rang twice before a tired voice answered. "Lawrence," I said, my voice steady and strong. "Conrad, it is 3 a.m. Lawrence groaned. "Are you all right?" "Do you need a doctor?" "I am fine, Lawrence," I replied, looking at the empty space above the fireplace. "I have never been better, but I have work to do. I want you to draft the papers for a new foundation first thing in the morning." "A foundation?" Lawrence asked, the sleep leaving his voice. "Yes," I said. "The Eleanor Sullivan Trust. I am liquidating Brandon's trust fund and Vanessa's assets. Every penny they tried to steal is going into it. We are going to build housing for homeless veterans. We are going to give second chances to men who were thrown away just like I was." There was a pause on the other end. "That is a lot of money, Conrad. That is the bulk of the estate." "I know," I said, smiling for the first time that night. "I cannot leave my fortune to my son Lawrence. He has chosen his path. So I will leave it to the men who actually know the meaning of honor. Get it done." I hung up the phone. The fire had died down to glowing coals. I turned my chair to face the window, watching the first hint of gray light touch the horizon over Lake Michigan. The long night was finally over. The sun was coming up, and for the first time in a long time I was ready to greet it. The morning mist hung low over the surface of Lake Geneva, a blanket of soft white that silenced the world. It was a silence I had earned. For the first time in 3 years, I was not waking up to the sound of a prison buzzer or the frantic ringing of a corporate telephone. I was waking up to the cry of a loon and the gentle lap of water against the hull of my small wooden boat. I sat in the stern wearing a flannel shirt that smelled of cedar and mothballs, my old fishing hat pulled low over my eyes. The suit was gone. The jumpsuit was gone. There was only the lake, the line, and the man. Lawrence sat across from me, looking uncomfortable in his windbreaker, holding a thermos of coffee as if it were a legal brief. He had driven up from the city to bring me papers to sign for the veteran housing project. The foundation was already breaking ground. We were turning the rubble of my family legacy into a fortress for men who actually deserved a home. But I knew Lawrence. He did not drive 3 hours just to get a signature. He had news. He cleared his throat, shifting on the hard bench. "We found him, Conrad." I did not look up. I kept my eyes fixed on the red and white bobber floating in the dark water. I did not need to ask who. There was only one ghost left to exorcise. "Where is he?" I asked, my voice quiet, blending with the rustle of the wind in the pines. "He is in Milwaukee," Lawrence said, opening a folder on his lap. "He is working at a fast food joint near the interstate. He is a dishwasher, Conrad. He works the night shift. He is living in a motel by the week. The report says he looks tired. He has lost weight. He sells his watch to pay for rent." I slowly reeled in the line, checking the bait. A dishwasher. The irony was so precise it felt like the hand of God. The boy who had mocked me for cleaning toilets, the man who had sneered at my gray uniform, was now standing in front of a sink, scraping grease and ketchup off plastic trays for minimum wage. He was finally learning the lesson I had tried to teach him for 40 years. He was learning that dignity is not found in a bank account. It is found in the callus on your hand and the sweat on your brow. Lawrence watched me carefully, gauging my reaction. "Do you want to reach out?" he asked softly. "We could send him something. Just a small stipend. Enough to get him out of that motel. He is still your blood, Conrad." I stopped reeling. I looked at the water where the reflection of the mountains was perfectly still. I thought about the hospital room. I thought about the oxygen tube being pinched shut. I thought about the shame in his eyes when he begged me to save him from his own choices. "No," I said, my voice firm and final. I looked at Lawrence, and for the first time in months I smiled. It was not a smile of vengeance. It was the smile of a surgeon who had successfully removed a tumor. "If I send him money, I rob him of the only chance he has to become a human being," I said. "He needs the soap. He needs the grease. He needs to know what it feels like to have nothing, so he can appreciate it if he ever gets something again. Mercy to the wolf is death to the sheep, Lawrence, and I am done being the sheep." I stood up and pulled my arm back, casting the line high and far. The lure soared through the air, a silver arc against the blue sky, before hitting the water with a clean, decisive splash. The ripples spread outward, touching the shores of a life that was finally mine again. "Let him wash dishes," I whispered to the wind. "Maybe one day he will finally be clean." I sat back and watched the bobber dance on the surface. The air was sweet. The water was deep. And justice, like the river, flowed exactly where it was meant to go. Here is the moral of the story and the CTA. The saga of Conrad Sullivan serves as a powerful reminder that true legacy is built on integrity, not inheritance. Wealth and status are fragile costumes that can be stripped away in an instant, but character is the skin you live in. Brandon and Vanessa believed that power gave them the right to trample on others, yet they forgot that the higher you climb on a ladder of lies, the harder the fall. Ultimately, Conrad teaches us that patience is a weapon, and silence is not weakness. Justice may be delayed, but for those who walk in truth, it is never denied. If you enjoyed this saga of justice and redemption, hit that subscribe button and share your thoughts in the comments below.